hear their experience of Greece from the early 20th century. Now, without further ado, I would like to say a few things about our presenter himself, who, as you know, is an associate professor of English at Suffolk University, the director of the Classics Minor and of the Poetry Center there. He is also the author of 4 poetry collections. Winthropos, the latest, has received the James Dickey Award for Poetry and appeared from Louisiana State Press in 2021. The Guide to Greece Poems was published by the same press in 2018, and he published also Dialogos, Paired Poems in Translation, published in 2021 by Anti-Lever Press in Champaign, and Camus, Garnet, Lyric Poems based on the notebooks of Albert Camus, published in Brooklyn, New York by Pressed Wafer Press in 2006. He has numerous anthologized poems and translations, as well as critical essays. And of course, he continues his affiliation with Boston University, which was also his alma mater for his doctorate. And last but not least, he has received the Poetry Prize, the Daniel Varujan Award, presented in honor of the Armenian victims of the Turkish genocide by the New England Poetry Club in 2008. Now, he teaches and publishes in a wide range of subjects encompassing Greek and Roman literature in translation, modern lyric poetry, and the pastoral tradition. Now, my experience working with Professor Kalogeris was that of an extremely learned and welcoming scholar. And in this spirit, I would like to welcome him to our small community and thank him for coming and issue an invitation for next year as well. So.
Thank you so much, Mata. I can't express how much respect I have for Professor Dova, that rarest of classicists, someone who knows poetry, understands it, and is also a genuine great linguist. So thank you, Mata. And I'm greatly honored to be here on Greek Independence Day week. I'm going to read a few poems, and then I'm going to show some images and read some more poems. I did make out a handout, if everyone has it. And you don't have to look at the poems. The first one is not on the handout, but you can just listen, and I'll let you know when those poems come on the handout. But if you take it with you, you might want to go back to them and see if they hold up over time. The name of my book is called Winthropos, and it's the Greekified name that my immigrant father gave to the town. And I want to read this poem. It's not on the handout, but it's the entry poem to the book, and it's called Winthropos. And it refers to the riddle of the Sphinx, which I think probably everyone here in this room knows is what's the creature that walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 at night. And of course, it's the human being. Winthropos. And if you get lost, Yodgaki, what will you do? I'll find some older people and tell them my name. Anything else? I'll tell them where I live. And where is that? 45 Locust Ave. And where is that? Winthrop. Then comes his vague, Winthrop, Yodgaki? Or is it Winthropos? Only now that I'm older than he ever was, and even in late middle age, wherever I am in my life, I still don't have the foggiest clue. Do I hear the rhyme? Obvious, unavoidable, It tells me the answer to the Sphinx's riddle is Anthropos, my father pulling my leg. One of the things I'm going to try to do, is that okay in the back? Are you hearing me okay? Is to try to sort of link together in certain ways the Greek-American immigrant experience of my father and his brothers, and my mother too, who was born here but grew up in New Bedford. And as my cousin Rini will tell you, she knows the story, my mother didn't know any English when she went into the first grade. So in effect, she was an immigrant too. They had a very closed Greek community in New Bedford. I want to read this poem that's on that handout, Peponia, about the melons. My father and his two brothers had a grocery store, and all of us kids worked there. And there are a number of poems that come out of that store, and this is one of them. Honeydew melons, swelling their shipping crates, kept cool in the damp cellar dark of my father's store, out of sight, but never so far out of mind that every so often a crowbar's iron talon couldn't pry open their plywood lids, suspending the nails like fangs. If ripeness is all, it was all in the way I saw the way my father cradled Peponia, turning them over slowly enough to keep the luminous pallor of their moist complexions fresh, still bright in the long look back through the cellar dark. All in the way he'd never say what he saw, but set them gently back down in their wooden crates. Then every so often, another aura would hover there in the afterglow of a dangling bulb's interrogating glare, which still can make my father's sisters appear, crouching together before a crumbling wall. I mean in that black and white snapshot my mother kept on her perfumed dresser with its oval mirror and those open, kerchiefed faces staring back from the open fields late in the 1930s, as if a crowbar angled into the dark were leverage enough to release the fragrant, opulent sheen of those who never cross over the water, but hover near whenever I say Peponia, honeydew melons swelling their shipping crates. Since what I write about has so much to do with memory, I want to read a poem about my mother and her late struggles with Alzheimer's. And that'll come back later. And I want to dedicate the poem to Stamatia's mother, who suffered the same affliction. And it's called Baby Monitor, which are those little kind of walkie-talkie devices. I think they're still in existence, right? To keep track of babies. Baby Monitor. She's sound asleep, or her Alzheimer's is. I can hear each breath she takes through the monitor I keep on my desk, hooked up as it is to the one upstairs beside her bed. The kind of listening device that's used for keeping track of infants. The tremulous speaker could fit in the palm of your hand. A little green light pulses every time it picks up any trace of my mother's voice. Babble of baby talk and muffled whimpers. Those garbled bits expelled from her speech machine, its plastic speaker propped all night on its stand, calling out softly, some rhythmical, ruminant something, so automatic it might be dreaming out loud in my mother's oblivious voice. A Sibylline machine that makes the incomprehensible clear. And please help her, and please guide him, and stop it from spreading to the kidneys, please, dear Lord. And make that enough to meet their mortgage payments. I'm privy to a prayer that no one else can hear, at least tonight. Some primal psalm where all are nameless, but none of them forgotten. And please, and please, and please goes the little green pulsing light. Before I go further, I want to look at some of these images. And the first one you see is, which Professor Dover talked about, Aquivos, way, way up in the mountains, extremely isolated, and yet, as I'm going to read in the next poem, for whatever reason, the Nazis got all the way up there with their tanks, and it was occupied. Let's go to the next one, and that's another shot, and you can go ahead to the next one. That's the only existing photograph of my father's entire family together. And this is my father's oldest brother, who's kind of, I don't know how they did it, but they photoshopped him in. You can see he's different. And my father, and my Uncle Charlie's there, my Uncle Peter, and that's my father, and my grandmother, and the sisters who I'm going to read about in a minute. And I think it was one of my cousins, I don't know if one of them here said, maybe it was Angie who said, that was the first time they wore shoes for this photograph. So you can go to the next one. That's my father and mother and my Aunt Kay and my Uncle Charlie when they first got married. Let's go to the next one. Next one. That's a shot very close to Aquivos in honor of Kalogeris and of a number of battles who were fought right in that area. So let's go to the next one. If you can blow that up. I'm going to come back to this later. This is an icon in one of the churches in one of the 7 churches in this tiny village. And my cousin calls it the lady with the bullet holes in her face. Because during the conflict with the Turks, in retaliation to Greek resistance, this icon was riddled with bullets. And they left it like that. And I'm going to talk about that later. So let's go to the next one. That's my father, my Uncle Peter, who's late father of my cousins Angie and Reen here, my Uncle Charlie when they first came to America. And it's, I won't get into too much of this today, but it wasn't unusual for them to come, coming from Greece with nothing, escaping famine, and getting here, and they're all young. They all were in their teenage years when they first left. And very soon, they found themselves, and my father and my Uncle Peter found themselves fighting in World War II in the Philippines. They probably had very little English at that time. Let's go to the next one. That's my father's father and my grandmother. I may read about that photo, but let's go to the next one. This is a memorial that was just put up in Kokova. It's a village where I'm going to read a poem about a Greek waiter, Mr. Chotos. And his family, they called the Chopé, were very instrumental in the resistance to the Turks. And his father lived in Winthropos. I was over his house all the time as a kid. They were almost like a second family to me. But his father, I'm going to read a poem about him and his very important things that he said to me about the Greek Revolution. Let's go to the next one. Can you blow that one up? Okay, that's my father and my Uncle Peter when they're leaving for World War II. And let's go to another one. I just want to show one or two more. Go to another one. Okay, so blow this one up. This is on the island of Peleliu in the South Pacific. And my Uncle Peter was on furlough. So he happened to meet up with my father, who was stationed there in the Army. One was in the Air Force, the other was in the Army. And they hadn't seen each other in 3 years. And they didn't know what was going on with their mother. It's probably better that they didn't know, because their mother's house was the headquarters for the Nazis. She may have been killed in a terrible way by the Nazis. I'm not sure. But that's where they had this reunion. And, thank you. Can you hear me okay? And they had this reunion, and the only other thing I know about this picture is that there's a bottle of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer that my father has buried in the sand to keep it cool for their reunion. So I want to go back, and we can come back to these photos later. I want to read on the handout. There's one called Sisters. That's two of my father's sisters when I went back to Greece in my early 20s. And the first were Neridi Vrishi. I'm going to pronounce it Vrishi, and I'm going to explain why later. Nereids are water nymphs, kind of mermaids. Sisters. Neridi Vrishi, wellspring of the Nereids. At least that's what it's called in my father's village. Cobblestone shaft, whose mossy, tremulous darkness I once looked way down into. Ice-cold water from melting peaks of the Peloponnese. And me, the shaky balance that tries to keep two buckets from spilling over as back down the slope I carry one for witty Evgeniki, the other for shrewd Yanula, my aunts from Akubos, who never fled their house when Hitler invaded, or during the Civil War that was even worse. My father's tiny, black-shawled, older sisters, so eager to know if their young American nephew, with all those books of poetry in his backpack, had seen the lovely ladies swimming up from the bottom of the well. Before I can answer, their elderly, elfin, kerchiefed heads are already bobbing up and down with mischievous laughter. Oh, murky depths and open, upturned faces, wrinkled water, a glitter, and brimming buckets, whose wire handles carved this line in my palms, Neridi Vrishi, wellspring of the Nereids. If we can just go a little further on the photographs, a little further. Okay, right there. The next poem is about this gentleman, Mr. Chotos, who was a waiter at Jimmy's Harborside, as so many of the Greek immigrants were. And he was remarkably well-educated through his own reading. I think what I learned, I studied with some great classicists, but the classics were a living heritage to Mr. Chotos. and he quoted them that way. And he said something to me that I never forgot, which is in this poem. He said to me that the heroes of 1821 were greater than the ancients. And that stunned me as a kid. And I think it maybe in a way turned me into a writer, because I thought, it's not just the ancients. There's this heroic modern Greeks. So here's the poem. Classics Illustrated was a kind of comic book which Rowley very generously got me a copy of. But when I was a kid, they had the Iliad, the Odyssey, even Shakespeare in Classics Illustrated. Classics Illustrated. So this one, too, is in the handout if you want to look at it. Late Saturday morning in my best friend's house. I'm 10 years old, reading the Iliad in the Classics comic book version, when Mr. Chotos enters the kitchen in his waiter's outfit. He's ready for another 12-hour shift at Jimmy's Harborside in Boston, where he'll be shouldering the loaded trays till midnight. For once, he doesn't greet me with Yasu Yorgo. Instead, he picks up the comic book and frowns. Achilles and Hector, he mutters, mythologia. And now, in his native Demotic tongue, the epic pronouncement. The heroes of 1821 are greater than anything in Homer. And next he's rattling off the Cleftic Hall of Fame, Makrianis, Kolokotronis, Androutsos. Then out the back door and down the back porch steps he goes, that Greek immigrant from the tiny village of Kokova, who fought against the Nazis, his silver tray as shiny as anyone's shield in Homer. By the way, Kokova is very close to Kalavrita, which was important both in the 1821 and, of course, a great massacre there in the Second World War. When I was a kid growing up, we went to Greek school 3 times a week. It was a little church school in Lynn. And I remember in the 3rd or 4th grade, one of the classrooms had photographs on the walls. And one of them was Kolokotronis, Bubulina, the great female admiral. And one of the figures was Lord Byron. And of course, Byron was a tremendous Philhellene and went to Greece and died in Missolonghi. He died of malaria. And he wrote a poem, famous poem, just before he left. On this day, I complete my 36th year. So he was 36. He was the most well-known figure in the world. There's probably no one comparable to how well Byron was known at the time. And he went to try to save Greece. And this has to do with one of my teachers at Greek school. And it's also in that handout. On this day, I complete my 36th year. It's Independence Day. Our Greek school teacher, Mr. Natsariotis, we called him Mr. Nazi behind his back, points at the faded portrait above the map and then at Missolonghi and tells us how Ovidinos caught a fever and how the doctors had tried to save the poet. Missolonghi, he says, is like Lynn Marsh, except with more mosquitoes. Leeches are worms to suck the blood from the sick man's sweating back and drain the poison. Then he reads us some poems. 40 years on, I hear Byron's ravishing English, filtered through an accent so thick, its nicotine rasp still rustles like sallow reeds in a shallow culvert. Lord Byron's embroidered vest was ink-blotter velvet. His tasseled fez was cocked at a jaunty angle. His porcelain jaw as smooth as a jutting sink. A warm, familiar blood the shades must drink to speak in Hades. O immigrant voice that mangled magnificent verses, allowing me to hear them in Greek broken English. O poetry, conjuring freedom and the droning tenses of conjugated verbs. O fever that feeds on the bold with a vampire's thirst and the jaundiced, unslakable wit of the satirist. O little church school between the sea and the suburbs. I want to read a poem now. Again, it sort of gets at memory loss, but I think counterbalances that with ritual, where ritual sort of regains the memory. And it has to do, it's part of a poem. This is one section of a much longer poem. But in this section, one of my cousins, my cousin Petro, had died very young. I think he was 30 years old. And his mother came from the village, came from Acoustic, and appeared at the funeral and at the graveside. And this is about that scene. I don't think there's anything else you need to know. It's part of a poem called Daedalus, but cemetery scene. Swinging his censer back and forth on its chain, Father Mijos therified the grave, chanting the resurrection through wisps of dispersing smoke. And then, at Woodlawn Cemetery in Lynn, Petro's mother, Aunt Evstasia, began the ancient folk lament, the Mirologi. Aunt Evstasia, lying face down on the earth, screaming into the ground the name of her son, Petro, begging the stones to take her to Petro. Even the elders aghast, and no one knowing how or when or if they should stop the keening, the daughter's hand over her mouth, the priest kneeling. And now my totally out of it mother steps out of oblivion, as if part of a ritual, too old to ever be touched by memory loss. Elakaimeni, get up, wretch. And she does. My aunt with the blades of grass on her long black dress, my mother absent-mindedly picking them off. Embracing, they slap each other on the back and across both shoulder blades. And that village way, Greek women show their mutual, hovering grief, as if to say to the dull thud of their backs and shoulder blades, it's here where the pinions should be if we weren't human and we could fly away. This one is another one about my mother, but a very different tonality, but about the language and about the poetry that was in that Demotic speech that produced all those tremendous folk songs, those cleftic songs, those lamentations, wedding songs. And it's called Brlitz School of Language. And you might think back to that Neridi Vrishi from the first words of this poem. Brlitz School of Language. It's Vrishi, not Vrishi, my teacher of modern Greek, who came from modern Greece, corrected me. Her accent was subtle, her English, British, but her inflection of the demotic word for fountain lacked the shiny, sibilant splash I always heard when one of the elders said, Vrishi. Backwater speech that kept going back to its source. Village springheads whose rustic mountain tongue still sang to us from the mouth of our kitchen faucet. I was a graduate student taking a quick refresher course when I complained to my mother about her pronunciation. Her people were Spartan. She stood by the sink. And where in Greece is she from, this teacher of yours? When I say Athens, it's Athens, dismissed with a wave of her laconic hand. Oh, I knew it. And then again, the sibilant gush of Vrishi, as fluent as faucet water, washing over the stack of stucco white dishes. I hope you sort of caught the sort of ancient antagonism between the Athenians and the Spartans there. And the word I used from my mother's hand, laconic hand, Laconia, Lacedaemonia. And that's one of the things, the great advantages you have as a sort of Greek-American poet, is you can draw on that and you can hit particular registers of the English that goes back through the Greek in a very natural way, I hope. I'll just read a few more, just 3 more, and we'll finish up. And we can have questions and talk. Vale. Caught in a sun shower on my way to school, I once took shelter by ducking under a willow. Its branches hung down so low, they swept the street. I was stepping through beaded curtains, thick as catkins. The rainwater glittered, running down the vines. My books and their slung green satchel stirred like seedlings. Black earth, moist roots, the bowl mouth oozing tar. I could have waited things out in the candy store, but I was shy. I was a firstborn. For years, I never knew why those elderly relatives would look at me that way. They spoke no English. Their coats were heavy. Whatever they'd been through, I stepped back out from under the veil of the willow, just as the dew was shining on everything, the houses, the sidewalk, even the dark Atlantic. I'll read 3 more. The remaining poems are not on the sheet. I want to read this poem, Memorial Day, because it's it has the phrase Magna Graecia in it, Greater Greece, which meant the Greeks who went to Sicily and spread through Rome. But it also, I think, has a sense of a diaspora. So this poem is called Memorial Day. At the cemetery in Winthrop, under the shade of the cypress trees. Our annual gathering is down to 30 or so, but the holy incense unfurls from its censer as fragrantly as ever. We stand before the grave of Teddy Spanis, our first arrival here to go down there. O little censer with your looping handle, orthodox dome that opens like a lid, the finest silverware of the tarnished tribe, set down on the marble countertop of the tomb, like a Russian samovar in the Hermitage. Now, one by one, before the chanting starts, it's the elderly women, same as always, who kiss the hand of the priest, then pass him an envelope with a little money in it and lists of names, names of the dead, as long as grocery lists. Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison. Lord, have mercy on us. Maria, Panayoti, Chrysula, Walter, Irini, Becky, Orestes. And there they go, in the rising smoke, our dear departed, as if their surnames were superfluous now. And there they go, our souls, on the way to becoming anonymous. But may their memory be eternal, chanted first in Byzantine Greek and then in English. Our people have lived in many places, our poets intone: Egypt, Syria, Turkey, even Commagene, a little kingdom snuffed out like a candle. There's hardly a breath of air as the wisps of smoke unfurl on the listless breeze and the names disperse under the shade of the cypress trees in Magna Graecia. I'm going to read two more, and one of them is a little bit shift in direction, but I think it's a poem I've read at every reading for the last year because of what's going on in Ukraine. It's a poem by the great Russian Jewish poet Osip Mandelstam. I translated it. I don't know Russian, but I worked with someone who was very, very excellent at it. And it was in my book, Dialogos. And this is Mandelstam's poem, As I Was Washing Myself in the Dark. Mandelstam, who died in the Gulag, the Soviet Gulag, and speaking back in this poem, speaking back against Stalin, but I think speaking back too against Putin. As I was washing myself in the dark, and Mandelstam spent a lot of time in the work camps, where he eventually died, and where this poem was written. As I was washing myself in the dark, washing outside where the ice-cold water kept spilling over the rim of the barrel, the evening stars against the horizon glisten like salt on the blade of an axe. As I was washing myself in the dark, I saw the locked gate that couldn't keep out the menacing look of my surroundings. Once it had entered my state of mind. Soon the weavers will weave a new pattern from anything they can get their hands on, looming there in the near future. No matter what fabric they happen to stitch, I don't think the seams will ever be finer than a single line of honest speech. Salt of the earth and stars of the sky, dissolving now in the water's reflection, this briny water that keeps turning blacker, like some purer shade of appalling death, as if our lips had already tasted what's steeped in the salt of worsening luck. As I was washing myself in the dark, washing outside where the ice-cold water kept spilling over the rim of the barrel, the earth edged closer to truth and terror. I'm going to finish a very short poem, but I need to say a few things about it. There's a poem by the great poet George Seferis called The Container of the Uncontainable. At least that's the way the Greek is translated. The Greek is ichoratu achoritu. And Kilian Charad, who translated that poem, have this note about the title, The Container of the Uncontainable. One of the epithets applied to the Virgin as the mother of the infinite, and therefore uncontainable deity. So the Panagia is the container of the uncontainable. It's also a phrase that finds its way back, as so often miraculously the Greek regenerates itself from the way that, I know Professor Dover would know this, but chora is used in Plato as a sort of empty, placeless place where everything comes to be. So regeneration. And that sense of the, I think the whole Greek revolutions and all the multiple revolutions that led to the major revolutions, all of the upstarts, uprisings, all of that was a kind of, that insatiable thirst for freedom was a kind of uncontainable that came out of the Greek world. And I'd like to read this very short poem and Origins. Behind the words, there is a poem. Behind the poem, there is a voice. Behind the voice, there is a breath. Behind the breath, there must be silence. Behind the silence is where the voice that speaks the poem is coming from. Inside the thirst, there is a well. Inside the well, there is no light. Inside the dark, there is an echo. Inside the echo, there must be longing. Inside the longing is where the water no bucket can hold is coming from. Thank you. Can certainly questions or...
Do you have a special place where you prefer to do your writing?
I do. And I always work in the basement of my house. And I don't know why, but there's something about walking down the stairs under the ground that, as always, for whatever reason, has the right kind of stillness, I guess.
And are there any particular implements that you use on a regular basis that you find to be either more soothing or more stimulating or more comforting in terms of the writing you do?
Well, I've always written the same way, and I'm someone who goes back to the typewriter days. So I write everything out by hand, and I never go to the computer until I feel like I'm very close to the last draft. I mean, I have many writer friends who work on the computer, and but I think it's a kind of romantic notion maybe, but I think it's true that in writing by hand, you're shaping the letters, and in the shape of the letters, you're activating your ear to the sound of the words. which is something that doesn't happen, for me anyway, on the keyboard. So thank you for those very fine questions. What?
I have the advantage of having read your corpus of poetry. Thank you, Markella. I have the advantage of having read all of your poems, but I was wondering if you could please talk to us about the experience with the gramophone and the sound O in Victrola.
Oh, yeah, I could read it if you want.
If that's okay with you, but this brings up so much the acoustic experience of shaping poetry.
Yeah, Marta's talking about a poem.
Since you have Akovos on.
Yeah, it's a poem that's based on a story that my Uncle Charlie, the youngest of the brothers, and I knew of the story because my cousin Angie recorded my Uncle Charlie not long before he died. And he told a story that it's hard to corroborate it, but he told this story that before the start of the war, he had sent his mother a Victrola record player. And she loved music. And when the war started, her husband was here in America, my father and his brothers were here, and no one knew the Nazis were going to end up in Acoustic. And they made their headquarters, the Nazis made their headquarters in her house because it was a two-story house. It was right in the center of the town. And what my uncle told me is that when it came time for the Nazis to leave, there was resistance by the villagers, and some villagers were killed, but what he remembered most was that they made a big bonfire, and they burned all the furniture. And there were the Nazis, according to him, used the record player, and they were probably playing Bach and Mozart and their great classical records, but they tried to throw the Victrola into the fire, and she said no, and they threw her. She said "Ochi," and they threw her into the fire. So it was that "Ochi" sound. I can read that to you if you like, if you would like to hear one more. Okay. All the way through this poem, there are O sounds. All the way through this poem, there are O sounds, which is what Mata was referring to. It's called RCA Victor. And I'm also happy to read this one because Angie is in this poem. RCA Victor. It's the O in Victrola, as dark as the O in Gladiola is golden, opens the mouth of my uncle's shade, who tells me about the abyss and the ancient brass horn of a record player, the one he sent to his mother in Akuvos, way up in the Peloponnesos, whose songs are steeped in open vowels, whose echoes I hear in Polemos, my father's brother's word for war, whose O's go back to Homer, whose gift was the brute operatic music of Polemos. It's the O at the end of Figaro, or a figment of my imagination, allows me to overhear those full-throated officers singing as Mozart blares from the confiscated Victor Victrola. But it's only when my uncle pronounces phonographos The antique crankshaft revolves in my hand and sets the valley echoing with all those O's, a disk so dark, not even some golden, silver age arpeggios could lighten the shade of the olive groves. It's a month before the plastic O of the breathing tube was put in his mouth. My uncle tells me about the bonfire, just so that I know how the village glowed. It's Germans burning the furniture and some of the houses before they go. It's the muted O and gramophone and my grandmother's obdurate ghost who won't let go of the brazen O of its horn. It's the screech of the swallowed O in Phoenix and the O in the middle of immolation, that smoldering, unmollified O. And now it's the O at the end of Velcro that straps the tube to his open mouth and keeps the dying fable ablaze in my uncle's throat, unspeakable. It's my aunt from Akuvos, the only one alive who would know, saying, Ochi, Nazis no kill her. I hear she die of stroke, but me too young to know. It's those rows of oleanders leaning, partisan this way, collaborant that, depending upon who swung from them. My cousin Angelo must pass below to get to Ayaya's overgrown stone, the one oblivion's river, however the oleanders hover over the names, flows under just the same. It's the O in the ouzo that Angie pours and showing us her photos, lo, of a date engraved in granite, a date that's later than the close of the war. Yet does it denote the year of death or the atonement of the internment, dear cousin? We toast your devotion, but drink oblivion's river, smoky as ouzo, smoky as the ossified O of the open pit where the bones are exhumed. O record revolving on Clotho's spindle, verse needle at home in the line's dark groove. O flaming, familial, apocryphal tongues, the O in Victrola, dark as the O in Gladiola is golden, Mozart. Sing by osmosis, O muse. Clotho is one of the three fates. So her name comes up spinning like that disc is spinning like the fate, spinning the thread.
What is the gladiola in that poem?
Gladiola is a flower, particularly golden kind of flower. And it's sort of like it reminded me of those old ancient horns of those photographs, that it was like a giant gladiola. It had a kind of shimmering quality.
Is that the fire as well of the burning and the?
I think so. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's very good.
Well, it's an incredible image. So we're not sure if it happened just that way, or is it more that we don't want necessarily in the family to remember it happening that way, the grandmother being.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of that, so many family stories of that period have that kind of narrative where no one's exactly sure. But that in and of itself is part of the history. I have a poem about my mother. I took my mother, this was in the 80s, 1980s. They had just opened the Ellis Island Museum in New York. And they were showing the ship's manifest, the list of passengers. So she wanted to see her mother's name, Aglaia Tsagaroulis. And it was on a microfilm then. And there was a young woman who was the guide. And she was saying, "Oh, we see there's your mother. She was a seamstress. She left Piraeus, she was 17 years old, and she was alone. And my mother said, no, she was 13 years old. And there was another girl with her. I think she died of TB, my mother said, but I know they wrapped her in a blanket and threw her overboard. And this young woman's face just blanched, but it was, it was the way that the oral record corrects what we think is the written history. No,
Have you ever?
I think I just been too far away from Greek to do that. I do translate from Greek to English, but I've never gone the other way.
Have you ever had any of your poetry translated into Greek?
Yes.
When it was translated and you were reading it in translation, you obviously you understand written Greek well.
Pretty good. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you were reading your own poetry in Greek translation, how did it strike you?
It struck me as the poem sounded better in Greek. And that's partly because I have an excellent translator, but it's also because I think the Greek has that polysyllabic, music. So it felt more expansive in the Greek somehow. Although English has its own powers, and the Anglo-Saxon and the Latinate words that it has. Anything else? Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kalogeris, and many thanks to all of you who came today. I would be remiss if I didn't express a very special thanks to the Maliotis Cultural Center for their hospitality, for their strong cultural presence on our campus, and for all the wonderful prospects they offer us as a community and as a school. And also for the wonderful buffet they have prepared for us. So please join me in thanking again Dr. Kalogeris and the Maliotis Cultural Center.